Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 12th of January 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. In the studio is Mike Robinson, deeply behind the technical desk. Now, we've got quite a busy news. Bear with us today. It's been quite interesting getting prepared, but shortly we'll be going live with Steve, who together with Mike will be talking about the Upton fracking camp and what's been happening there. Before we start with that, a few words on the weather. Pretty cold, wet, showery in Plymouth, and that seems to be reflected across the country. I understand that it's also wet and windy in Pembrokeshire. So those corgis are definitely going to need their coats. We've also got an update on Tom Crawford's court case. That's the Crawford 7, as we're calling them. There's some good news there. And the rest of our news today will be covering events across the country. Mike, how are we doing?
So the Upton camp eviction is happening as we speak, or at least they're trying to. And I'm joined by Steve Spy. Steve, are you there?
Yeah, I'm at the top of the tower on the site. We've got bailiffs running all over the place. We've got multiple lock-ons. We've got people in tunnels. They've got the work cut out. So I'm looking down on them from the tallest point on the camp, and they are slowly moving through. They've made a pig's ear of bringing out a cherry picker onto the site. They've got a JCB
unit. Well, actually, we've got a photograph of that, Steve. If we roll through a couple of the pictures. First of all, we've got a picture of the police outside, and I noticed on your live stream earlier that you were suggesting they have people qualified for moving underground as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, they've got one guy. He's just got kitted out in divers equipment and that, and they're basically trying to get down one of our tunnels.
Right, and how many tunnels are there?
In total, there's about five tunnels, all in individual sort of sections, and that all going up on different things. We've had 2 years to prepare the site, so there's quite a network. They've not found all of the tunnels yet, so I don't want to disclose too much on that.
Sure. But clearly, this must be costing a fortune.
Yeah, specialist teams that they're brought in to do this. Climbing people, caving people. The police are ringing the whole field. So just on a police budget alone, it's huge. The helicopter's been used. So yeah, there's quite an expense going into that.
Okay, and we do actually have an image of the cherry picker, and they did try to bring this into the field, and it basically sank.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's far too heavy for this. So it's totally waterlogged the field. So it's not a kit, and it's just sat there now. It's going nowhere. So I think they're just planning now. They've been scratching their heads for quite a while. We're just waiting for them to move into our position there, where we'll lock on and try and just hold out as long as possible.
Brilliant, and of course, every minute that you hold out, it's costing them quite a bit of money.
Yeah, well, obviously we just want to hold up the whole fracking process. We can't let one hole go into the ground. This process will kill people, and in this particular case, we've got Chesterton around. It's absolutely nonsense to try and drill and contaminate this water aquifer here.
Yeah, brilliant. Sorry, Brian.
Steve, can you hear me? It's Brian Gerrish.
Yes, I
Steve.
can hear you.
Hello there. Well done to all of you. Can you just tell our viewers and listeners what is the mood amongst the police? Are you managing to have sensible conversations with them, or are they in there?
Yeah, the police are taking a step back on this one. Like, they've got liaisons running around. They're all smiling and happy. Like there's no issues with the police. They're just leaving it up to the bailiffs who are making very slow progress in shifting the people off there. Some of the stuff that they've got to cut through are massive chunks of concrete. It's going to take some hours for them to do that, and obviously there's us at the top of the tower, which they'll have to think about shifting.
Right. Well, we'll be saying a bit more about bailiffs in just a few moments because, of course, bailiffs and how they operate is coming more and more to the fore and has been one of the key parts of the Tom Crawford mortgage eviction case. Okay, and what about local officials? Have you had any people from local councillors turn up or people from the local authority?
We had Matt, our local councillor there. He turned up and he was moved away. They've been shoving the press out of the way. I think they really want peace and quiet to move in and sort of conduct their exercise on the field.
Okay, that's a good point. What about press coverage? Has there been any mainstream or local press?
We've had the BBC down, ITV, we are on mainstream television. The One Show was supposed to be coming down today and doing a section, so I believe they're coming down. I can just see in the far field now that people off an area of land. It's nothing to do with this field, but they can see where we are, and they can stream from there, and they're being moved away down by bailiffs.
Right. Okay, and can you tell us the name of the bailiff's firm? Do you know it?
It's UK Evict.
UK Evict?
Yes, it's a specialist firm that they use for this type of exercise to evict people from protest sites. Obviously, very expensive teams obviously I guess must have loads of money to bandy around because they're spending a fortune on this eviction.
Right, okay. And do you have any message? Is there anything you'd like to say to the wider public? You're there at the top of the tower. You're protesting about the dangers of fracking and the damage it can do.
You can't let this industry get a foothold in this country. It's important that we stop it now, and we're putting ourselves in harm's way, a personal risk to try and get the message out to the wider public. They're going to be doing this up and down the country. Everybody needs to get out in the local areas and don't let them get any holes in the ground. It's absolute madness. It will kill a lot of people.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much for that very good report, and we'll be happy to broadcast more as events unfold with you. And okay, thank you for that. Obviously, that's a key comment, the dangers of fracking. Ian Crane and all those activists, as you've just heard Steve say, putting themselves at risk, trying to stop huge environmental damage and also risk to the health of the population. Don't just take our reports, investigate yourself and research yourself about the dangers of fracking. Well, let's just move on to good news, and that is we've got a result which came in about an hour ago to the Tom Crawford court case. This is where supporters of Tom Crawford, including his son, had been in court for some 8 days. Basically, they'd gone back into Tom's repossessed property, and although they were quiet and well behaved and simply providing food to people, they're arrested essentially for affray, and that goes to a jury trial. Well, this is the news that after 8 days, all of them, that's 7 accused, have been found not guilty. The case has been dropped and costs have been awarded to the accused. Now, there were some quite remarkable things came out during this trial. This is the number one key point, that no signed warrant was ever produced in court. This is fundamental to the whole case. The whole taking, the repossession of Tom Crawford's house was done from the outset without any signed warrant. So this is the bailiffs acting essentially outside authority. And it appears that the court, I'm going to say the court staff were adamant that no warrant was going to be produced in court, because it was admitted in court there was no signed warrant. I'll just add a couple of other points there, Mike, to that slide, if I may. We've also got that no supporting documents in relation to the warrant were produced. These are the provenance documents. Obviously, there has to be an application for a warrant. So if you claim you have a warrant, there must be the supporting document which shows the trail, who requested it, and who signed it off. None of that was produced at all. 2 of the defendants held a no plea, no case to answer stance. This was very important because at one stage the judge, Fowler, attempted to bully them into making a not guilty plea. They said, no, we're making no plea because there is no case to answer. And it took some courage for them to keep to that stance. And then basically 4 of the defendants successfully represented themselves. 3 had barristers, 4 successfully represented themselves. And as Guy Taylor said to me this morning, what this proves is that people who do the research have got the courage to go into court and understand the basic procedures, can successfully defend themselves, particularly where there is corruption and criminal action within the judicial process itself. We'll come back to no signed warrant, so no document upon which to base the repossession of the house. And the last point is that the judge for several days was saying, I'm really not sure why this trial is taking place, because even if the defendants are found guilty, what are we going to do with them? It's going to be a very minor sentence. After 8 days at huge cost to the taxpayer, thousands, tens and tens of thousands of pounds, no surprise, not guilty, and the case dropped. What does this show? Well, it shows that the truth about mortgage fraud, corruption within the courts is coming to the surface. And it's also showing that where people stick together, do their homework, prepare properly for these court cases, they can win. Now, I believe that we should have Justin Walker waiting on the Skype line. So, Justin, if we can bring you in, perhaps you might like to comment on that Tom Crawford case, if you could hear everything I've reported.
Absolutely excellent news, but it just shows what happens when the system is shown up for what it is. And, well done to the judge. I think some of these judges and people like that are now starting to realize they are defending the indefensible. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of them are not actually saying, okay, I'm going to go with this because we know which way the wind's blowing. And I think you're going to find senior members of the judiciary and people like that will be coming onto our side, which at the end of the day is the side of truth. It's as simple as that. We are the ones who are exposing the system, which is a thoroughly fraudulent and corrupt system that has been evolved over the years, over the centuries, and good people are unraveling it. So I think it's excellent news and well done.
Thank you for that, Justin. It's also going to be very interesting to see what the mainstream media makes of it, because there was an ITN reporter as just one who's been present through the case. And of course, all of the members of the public present who are aware of the case were filling him full of information about why the documentation is significant. So it could just be that even if there's no public statement by mainstream, the truth is burrowing its way back into their organisations. But Justin, you were keen to come and talk to us today on the subject of the Swiss alternative currency, which we mentioned a few days ago.
Now, Right. Well, I'm going to slightly change things, if I may, because I've just been given a startling stop press, which I've sent you guys, but obviously with what's happening with the fracking camp and everything else. The head of RBS is telling everyone to sell, mining shares, oil, the lot. The panic has started. Now, I feel a bit like, if you know your history, when the Germans attacked the Low Countries in France, they attacked on May the 10th, 1940. Well, I feel today is a bit like May the 9th. That is, something is building, it's building fast, and we've got to start to really get the message out strong and hard. Now, I was sent some information yesterday. I don't know if you're going to cover this already, but it says here, I'm going to have to read it here. Historic first, North Atlantic, empty of cargo ships in transit, all anchored along coasts, none moving. Now, along with this,
can I just make a comment about that, Justin?
Okay.
Well, basically, that article was very interesting as far as it went, but in fact, it's not totally accurate.
Right.
Now, it is fair to say that the Baltic Dry Index, which is the main sort of measure of how much trade is being, or how much container traffic is going across the oceans, is at an all-time record low. That is correct. Right. And it is fair to say that if you look at the the breadth and the depth of the high street sales that we've got on at the moment, it's pretty clear that retailers are not shifting product. And so all the general points that are made in that article are absolutely valid. But I think their specific comment about the fact that there's nothing moving in the oceans isn't quite right. But it's significantly reduced. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, I will concur with that. I mean, but as I said, it did come from a credible source. So that's why I've obviously brought it on today. But I did send you guys only just before the show started, because I was only alerted to this email about the RBS from my contacts. So if you can, perhaps, I don't know, before the end of the program, you may be able to salvage it. I don't know. But certainly it does sound very worrying when the head of finance or the head of credit control at the RBS is basically telling people to sell, sell, sell. So we are getting the signs that something is building. We have the conference at Davos. I think it's only a week away or 2 weeks away. So I'm just very uneasy the way things are. But we'll come back to that, and we'll get back to what we're talking about in Switzerland and so forth. Yes. Now, you last week you touched with Alec the idea that the Swiss National Bank there's going to be a referendum by this organization that's been set up to encourage the Swiss National Bank to issue debt-free, interest-free money on behalf of the Swiss government. Now, I'd just like to make 2 points. First of all, it's a Swiss National Bank, yes, but it is still signed up to the central banking system, so the national part doesn't really come into it. It is very much a fully paid member of the Bank for International Settlements. And obviously the Swiss is notorious for being a secretive banking country where people can have private Swiss bank accounts and so forth. The Swiss National Bank will certainly know all about what the Bank for International Settlements is really about. And it's just surprising that the Swiss have a treasury just like ours. I haven't got the name in front of me, but it is equivalent to a Swiss treasury. And the real solution, as we know with the Bradbury and the greenback dollar, so forth, is for the treasury of the Swiss government to issue and control debt-free, interest-free money that's based on the wealth and potential of the Swiss nation. Now, this campaign that has achieved over 100,000 signatures came about because of Positive Money in the UK. Now, Positive Money, for those who don't know, has been around for about 3 or 4 years, and they've been advocating that basically they acknowledge that money is created by the bankers out of thin air as debt, and that is wrong, and hats off to them. They have certainly raised the profile of showing people that the money, only 3% is created by the Bank of England as currency. The rest is created out of thin air by the private banking cartel. So hats off to them on that. But right from the outset, when we got to hear about the Bradbury pound, and having already known about the greenback dollar and the principle behind that, and that is the Treasury issuing and controlling debt-free, interest-free money and not a private bank, when we approached them, we were told immediately, no, as far as they're concerned, the Bank of England must issue and control the money. And they they didn't even want to debate about the fact that we have a perfect precedent of the Treasury issuing, controlling its own money with the Bradbury, as things happened in 1914. And then when I raised the issue of how the central banking operation worked, they were reluctant to they don't want to acknowledge the whole central banking system and how the Bank for International Settlements operates, and how we know from eyewitness accounts that effectively the Bank for International Settlements is the mechanism by which the big banking families, the House of Rothschild, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs and so forth, basically control the world's money system. 95% of the world's GDP is controlled by the Bank for International Settlements. And it's an organization that hardly anybody knows about. Barely 1% of the British people have probably heard about it. And I'm afraid many of our elected representatives in Parliament don't know what the Bank for International Settlements does. So I'm very worried that when you have this referendum in Switzerland, which is basically saying, yes, we must have our country issue and control its own money, the mechanism by which they want to see it done is through a central bank, which belongs to the Bank for International Settlements, which in turn, positive money, which created this network of countries who are now starting to ask for debt-free, interest-free money, they do not want to debate. I find it rather strange. I don't know what you think, Mike.
Well, in principle, I agree. I, as you know, challenged positive money publicly on the UK Column website over the Bank of England issue, and they objected to that criticism quite strongly. But they didn't really answer the questions which I was raising. So it is a debate that needs to be had, Justin, and I think it'd be really nice if they would actually engage in a constructive way on it.
This is the sad part. I'm endeavoring to be friendly and constructive because I want these people on our side. They've done a great job in exposing the fact that the private banks are creating money completely out of thin air as debt. And this is wrong. If we're going to have the liquidity for a happy and prosperous nation, we cannot have private banks being in charge. So this has got to end. But I just don't quite understand why they believe the Bank of England is the right vehicle to do this when the Bank of England is riddled with secrecy. When, for instance, Mark Carney goes every six weeks or so to a private meeting of around about 10 or 12 of the top central bankers, and, you know, this is all done in secret, so there'll be, I don't even know if minutes are taken, but the point is, whatever he is told to do by the banking families, or what they discussed themselves there at that meeting, does he report back to George Osborne in full and gives George Osborne a blow-by-blow account? Do all his directors of the Bank of England know what was said at these meetings? Because one of them is a top union leader from Unison, who is obviously trying to fight against austerity and so forth. So we just don't know. Everything is riddled with secrecy, and how can that be right when to have effective money creation and money supply, you want full accountability and you want full transparency?
Yeah. Justin, thank you very much for that analysis of what was going on. Alex Thompson, who wasn't able to be with us today because he's feeling a bit poorly, but he's made a comment for us that there's an excellent book on the Bank of International Settlements called The Tower of Basel.
Yes,
we will encourage people to have a read of that. I'd also just like to say that it's our policy at the moment. UK Column would like people to be asking questions about the banking system, because this brings the wider public on board. They're curious. They want to know what the answers to these questions are. Many people want to go straight for the jugular at the moment and brand every single banker as a criminal. Is that the case? I personally don't think so. Yeah. But what we are doing here is asking the penetrating questions, the answers to which bring the truth up to the surface. Justin, we'll move on. We've got quite a few other items for the news. But thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, cheers.
With your bulldog. Okay, well, the BBC is telling us it's started. Here we go with yet another terrorist raid. 2 held over Syria-related terror offences. 2 men arrested in Warsaw. But there's no immediate threat to the public. But of course, all of the government prevent documentation is saying that we should be fearful of each other, we should be spying on each other, and we should be very worried about what is due to take place. Well, the BBC not only whipping up the fear factor, Mike, but as you were pointing out yesterday, it's pretty liberal with the truth, particularly reporting about Syria. What's your update?
Well, let's just have a quick update on Medea first. As we mentioned yesterday, food has started going in, and various tweets have been coming out telling us all what a great job is going on with regard to the trucks that are heading in. And of course, this image, this infographic that was sent out today, is saying 250 tons of food, which is enough for 40,000 people for 1 month. Now, if you look on Wikipedia, that will tell you Medea has a population, or had a population in 2004 of 9,000 people. When Vanessa was on with us on Friday, she was putting it at around 20,000 at the moment. So clearly, lots of food for lots of people has gone in there. And the question that we just want to continue to ask is, who is now controlling that food, and is it getting into people's mouths, which is the key point that one of the key points that Vanessa was making on Friday, that a lot of the food was falling into the hands of the so-called opposition, the armed opposition, and that in fact it was them that was putting the prices up beyond what people could afford. But anyway, as we discussed yesterday, well, let's talk about the BBC first, because this article was published a few days ago, and I thought it was quite ironic and timely. How is citizen journalism transforming the BBC's newsroom practices? Maybe this gives us some enlightenment as to what happened with regard to the Medea report that we talked about yesterday from the BBC. And this article says user-generated content. It's on, by the way, the RB blog, which is all about the future of the BBC. It says user-generated content offers new ways of covering black hole stories such as the Syrian conflict. But how do journalists make sense of what is happening on the ground? While journalists do still report across parts of the country, UGC, which is citizen journalism effectively, is a vital storytelling tool, particularly where there are no journalist boots on the ground. It could be footage of the aftermath of barrel bombing in Homs, or the airstrikes in Idlib, which was distributed by media activists at the end of last year. These individuals are no longer just citizens, but have become producers, both users and producers. And identifying what can and should be used from these sources is a skill journalists have had to learn. All of those interviewed for the research said they had experienced a steep learning curve in developing new practices and measures to ensure non-BBC content could go on air. These range from being proficient at verification processes using a variety of technologies and developing relationships with those providing the content. BBC journalists are frequently in contact with groups such as local coordinating committees across Syria, the Sham News Network. Many meetings began on Skype or with BBC journalists facing the owners of YouTube accounts who had uploaded content, in some cases via interaction on Facebook. Journalists are nonetheless conscious that some of those sharing content are doing so along political lines and may exaggerate reports of deaths or violence in a bid to highlight their cause. This raises questions of balance, and it is for the BBC journalist, using their learned skills, to try to make sense of it all. And it goes on to say the media landscape has undoubtedly become more collaborative and interactive. The audience participation at all levels is now a consideration for journalists who harvest content from websites, tweet the audience directly, and encourage contributions to their programmes. While one cannot generalise, it seems the relationship between BBC journalists and people within Syria has changed throughout the course of the conflict, with journalists in many ways acting more like facilitators of news coming out of journalistic black hole. With the rise of the Islamic State and more producers than ever before, it looks likely that the BBC will have to continue developing these practices both in Syria and beyond. So if that's the case, if it's the case that the BBC is going to start using this user-generated content in a growing sense, then I think they pretty much need to get a lot better at it, because as we highlighted yesterday, this was one of the examples of where they absolutely got it wrong, either intentionally or not. I have no idea which it was. Of course, just in passing, I'll mention that the BBC has now edited this video clip to remove that young boy from the story. Needless to say, despite the email that I asked for comment, no comment was forthcoming. Let's just remember that this young man actually came from the Yarmouk refugee camp and was recorded in 2014 and was not in Medea at all over the weekend when the BBC said he was. So what do you make of that, Brian? I mean, what we're seeing is the BBC talking about making use of more and more user-created content, user-generated content, without, it seems, I mean, if people like us and Vanessa, who are not professionals at this, are able to validate the content of BBC Stories, surely they should be able to do a better job of it than they are.
Well, that's true, Mike, but I think there's something even more devious going on with the BBC, and we have to bring people's minds back to our reports on BBC Media Action, because the BBC's very own charity has been saying that they are the ones training citizen journalists. So the BBC goes into Egypt or Syria or Somalia or Syria, Libya. It trains people. It then coaches them to produce the very news that the BBC wanted in the first place. So I think what we're seeing in this BBC paper, I haven't read it myself, I'm only reacting to what you've shown us today, is the fact that the BBC is setting up its own network of citizens journalists, and they will be the ones producing the news as if they're independent, but of course they're trained and they're BBC stooges in the very first place.
Yeah.
I may be being a bit cynical, but of course we can't trust the BBC. We've got another article here. This is Exaro pointing out that basically a police officer was leaking the identities of child abuse survivors, which were then being passed through to the BBC for use in their Panorama documentary, which set out from the beginning to undermine the abuse survivors that had come forward to report what they'd suffered. And of course the BBC was doing its best to protect politicians in the establishment from accusations that there were high-level paedophile rings operating, particularly in and around Westminster. So we decided, of course, to talk to the BBC. We gave them a call this morning. We spoke to Panorama's media team and asked them for comment. And what did they say? In response to your query, we will not be commenting on this story. So Panorama, it would appear, using the leaked data of highly vulnerable people. And what were they using that data for? To help close down investigations into paedophiles. Well, of course, BBC, not the only ones engaged in that. A report from the church here that a disgraced bishop, this is the former Bishop of Gloucester, who got away with numerous accusations of sexual abuse before he was finally jailed. But what has now come to light is that the police who were investigating his crimes, running on from, I think, the late 1970s through into the early 1990s, police who were investigating were effectively told, stop your investigations, because if you carry on with this, it may embarrass the church. And the plan was to ship this man for Christian work overseas as a solution. In fact, the police backed off and then he stayed working in UK. So absolute outrageous behaviour by the church. And in reading this article, my mind went back to the plight of Teresa Cooper. Now, I'm going to say that I do not believe that we actually reported on this story when it broke in January 2015. This is the lady who, as a youngster, was put in a Church of England children's home, Kendall House, that's the picture on screen, where along with particularly girls, but some boys were included as well, they were drugged unconscious for days at a time, and during the period that they were unconscious, they were raped and sexually abused by men who were invited in. It took Teresa Cooper years of very, very hard work, often very stressful, not only her own memories, but pressures and threats put upon her as she tried to get the truth out about the abuse, her own abuse and that of other people. And one of the things that she had to talk about was that many of the women who gave birth later in their lives suffered birth defects as a result of the huge doses of drugs that were being used on girls in this Church of England home. She succeeded in getting compensation for at least some of the victims, but the Church of England went out of its way in order to close down this investigation. And what better evidence can there be of a high-profile institution in this country, the Church of England, covering up on the abuse of youngsters? Well, where can we go from there? We'll just move on through. Probably it's good to have a look at Mr. Welby, head of the Church of England, and we pointed out he seemed a lot more comfortable hobnobbing with the very bankers who are causing the distress and economic harm in the world today. There he is, socialising with the great and the good. But we're getting deeper into what's been going on in the Church of England, aside from covering up the abuse of children. And we come to this man, Sandy Miller. We just link these things together. Apparently he was the man who encouraged Mr. Welby to go into the church, where he's risen to a position of immense power. This is all linked into the Holy Trinity Brompton Church in London. And the moment you go in that direction, of course, you're through to Nicky Gumbel, the man who created the Alpha Course, which UK column will say we think equates to common purpose for churches. But who is also connected with this group of people? Well, we've got connections with Tony Blair and his Faith Foundation. We've also got connections into the Christian Socialist movement. What is that doing? Well, it says it's there for Christian principles, but in fact the language is very political, the transformation of government and structures. Certainly what none of these Christians are doing is working out how they can help the youngsters not only abused by the Church of England itself, but other government institutions across the country. So a lot of research to be done. We have received some very fascinating emails from people over the last few days who are also concerned as to what's happening at the higher levels of Lambeth Palace. If you are a researcher and you'd like to get digging into the invasion of Christianity with politics, we'd be very grateful for any factual research you can provide us. Well, the Alpha Course of itself, based on Nicky Gumbel's little green book. The Evening Standard had a really excellent article here, which was pointing out that the Alpha Course seemed to be a creation for the very, very wealthy in the banking and hedge fund industry. And amongst other things, this article pointed out that Ken Costa, the chairman of Alpha's international arm, a successful banker, rolls with Lazard's UBS, and he's also working with a private equity firm set up by a group of former Goldman Sachs employees. Of course, these are all the organisations which are going flat out to feed the hungry worldwide and to help all the people in the so-called developing countries, I don't think. Well, it gets worse because, of course, remember that our illustrious Prime Minister, David Our King Cameron, not only brings the police out if people get a bit too excited about the need for food banks, but this is the key thing, that he believes that his big society is a continuing part of Jesus' work. We think this is very, very dangerous political rhetoric. David Cameron, it would appear, is in exactly the same camp as Tony Blair with his Faith Foundation. But let's just think about a political objective of big society is, according to David Cameron, part of the work of Jesus. Well, thank you very much to the person who took time from our report yesterday to get digging into FTAC. And they came up with this amazing document, which appears to be part of a much larger document. But this is the first time we've seen a detailed definition of what FTAC is about. It says it was established in the UK in 2006 to assess and manage the risk to dignitaries from isolated loners pursuing idiosyncratic requests or causes, and fixated in its title refers to obsessional preoccupation with a person, place or cause. Now, the meat of this is that we have a unit which incorporates psychiatric staff working alongside police officers. So without you knowing anything is happening, somebody makes an accusation that you're suffering from mental illness, one of the so-called created illnesses that psychiatrists can now use from their book of spells. And in comes the police FTAC unit to arrest you, section you, and presumably you disappear. This is not Stasi, this is not the Soviet Union, this is not even North Korea. This is David Cameron's Britain in 2016, and we will say becoming increasingly dangerous by the day until enough of the public start to say no more. Well, we reminded people of Theresa May's role in this, a huge network of spying organisations, including GCHQ, and a massive raft around the Cabinet Office with links through to Israeli intelligence services and the so-called Applied Behavioural Psychology Unit. But as we've just seen from David Cameron's comment, that all of this spying outfit is actually buried within his so-called big society, which David Cameron seems to believe is part of the work of Jesus. I wonder whether FTAC should possibly be thinking about knocking on the door of our Prime Minister. Well, so that we don't forget, Common Purpose, who we've mentioned, are still at it, and here they are from their own website, busy training the Avon and Somerset Constabulary in how to act outside authority, act outside their silos, and to work as future leaders to transform society into the Common Purpose mould. And of course, remember that it was Common Purpose that was the organisation working very hard to bring in state control of the media.
But sorry, just put that one back up, Brian, a second, because this is the Collab course, right? Which as well as all the things that you've mentioned, is also organising around the idea of collaboration and collaboration with other organisations. So this brings us back to the sort of the group of organisations working together to cover up each other's wrongdoings. Isn't that what this is about, really?
Well, it's always seemed to be the case with Common Purpose. Wherever we've looked, and we're looking at the misuse of public funds, or the abuse of children, or the failure to get the police checks done on Common Purpose staff. Very dark organisation. Of course, roots in Demos as a Marxist organisation.
Okay, so I wanted to highlight this article in Prospect, on the Prospect website. This is by Malcolm Rifkind, and it's called EU Referendum, Will Cameron Be a Lame Duck Prime Minister? And he says, if Britain sides against Cameron in Europe, his authority will be shattered. When sometime this year the people of Britain cast their votes in the European referendum, they not only could change the whole course of British history, they could also bring David Cameron's residence at 10 Downing Street to a sudden and dramatic end. Now, of course, at first glance, you think, good stuff, let's go for it. But the question is, what is this article really about? I'll ask for your comments in a second, Brian, but you know, the notion that Cameron could be brought down if he loses the referendum, is that a warning or is it a threat?
It was probably a bit of both, I would say. Interesting that I think you said Rifkin is the man who's
that's right,
who's come out with this statement. Of course, Rifkin disgraced as chairman of the Defence Intelligence Committee over some matter with a Chinese company. But never mind, forget that, because clearly he's the man to believe about what's going to happen to the Prime Minister. I think David Cameron will certainly go, and they will be very keen to bring in Theresa May, because, as we've just pointed out, she is the powerhouse now driving the Stasi state.
But in a sense, of course, this is part of the EU referendum psyop, because as Rifkin points out, Cameron is going to organise for staying within the European Union, but of course that only depends on whether he can bring back a proper agreement in February between him and the other European leaders for the new relationship between Britain and Europe. And of course, what isn't being said in any of the British press, but which we have been highlighting for months now, is that he may well come back with some kind of rhetoric that he can sell to people with regard to immigration or benefits tourism. But on the other side of that coin will be the EU Army, the EU Treasury, the EU Foreign Office, and further EU integration.
Further in EU integration, Mike, and a comment that's just come up in the chat box. Apparently, the French have announced that they're very keen to mobilise 150,000 French teenagers. I believe that's about half the total number available. And these are going to be used as the community activists. This is exactly the same agenda that Cameron has in his big society. And those teenagers in the sort of 15 to 19-year-old bracket are the ones being put through the common purpose type training so that you have state citizens to help push through the rest of your agenda, spy on individuals, so-called anti-terrorist roles. I think they are desperate to keep the European project together at the moment, which is why we're seeing the upping of the terrorist fear factor. That enables you to bring in all these controls in the background. And as we're seeing, we've got big society now emerging in Britain and France.
Right, moving on then. War, of course, because as Justin has hinted at, with the continuing collapse of the financial system, the issue of war becomes closer. And the latest sort of axis here has been this problem between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, Saudi Arabia massively suffering as a result of the oil price at the moment. They'd be delighted to have another war that would help them sell some of their, or get rid of some of their armaments and munitions and help them sell quite a bit more oil. But anyway, this is Iran saying that they will not allow provocations from Saudi Arabia to derail efforts to regulate the Syrian crisis, according to Sputnik here. And they're saying that we are witnessing in the arena of regional developments what we are witnessing in the arena of regional developments is Saudi Arabia's agitating approach. Saudi Arabia intends to leave a negative impact on Syria's crisis through its escalating actions. We will not allow Saudi Arabia's tension-generating approaches to leave a negative impact on resolution of the Syrian crisis. But of course, it goes much beyond that, because they're although they're not directly attacking Iran at the moment, certainly on a political basis they are. And Sputnik also reporting that Russia is now forming 3 new military divisions in the western part of Russia. This is according to the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. And he said that they are going to build ranges, munition depots, and accommodation for troops in the western military district. He said, I cannot help stopping at the most important task of forming 3 new divisions to the west. This is the most important task. And again, Brian, this has got to be in response to the continuing pressure that Russia feels from NATO in the eastern states.
Well, it's pressure and provocation, isn't it, Mike? We've talked about this, NATO running right up onto the Russian borders, and inevitable that Russia would react. So if we pin it down, we've got warmongering by David Cameron consistently, and this is now having an effect with the terrorism and the way Russia's reacting.
And of course, it's not just Russia that's feeling the pressure, because China as well. Of course, North Korea is being used as the proxy for this. And we mentioned the fact that after North Korea had experimented with their little mini H-bomb last week, that the United States had overflown South Korea alongside South Korean aircraft, and that the South Koreans were reporting themselves that this aircraft was carrying nuclear weapons at the time. Now, this report here from F-World is pointing out that the commander of the combined South Korean U.S. forces, who is Curtis Scaparotti, has ordered that U.S. forces there maintain the highest level readiness position. They're really trying to ramp up the tension across the border. We've already seen the news reports that they've rebuilt the huge Tannoy system, which is firing propaganda across the border at the North Koreans. And according to this report, the Korean Defense Ministry is sending more U.S. strategic forces into South Korea. They're trying to organize that, including B-2 bombers, nuclear-powered submarines, F-22 stealth fighters. So they're trying to really ramp up the militarization in South Korea. And of course, North Korea isn't really the target of this.
No.
There's not much more to say.
Not much more to say. Well, if President Putin is creating 3 more divisions, capacity bigger than the British Army is really what's going on there. Let's have a look at what's happening to British armed forces. We have consistently warned of the attack on British armed forces, and part of that has been to destabilise them from the inside. The Herald here, Royal Navy sailor accused of secretly filming sex in warship showers. We've labelled it Sun Sea Satanism and Sex because this is the reality of the military. Ministry of Defence, having approved Satanism, is now trying to say, well, we didn't really approve it. We don't really approve of it. But in the meantime, we are seeing the effects. Clearly, this is orchestrated, Mike. This is not accidental. We've got a massive attack on veterans. We've got a big attack coming out on inappropriate behaviour on the battlefield in Iraq and etc. I think they are really going to destabilise and destroy the British military so we can create the European Army and Armed Forces. What are our local MPs doing? Well, here's Oliver Colville. Now, this is really fascinating. This is the man who has been promoting hedgehogs. We said, is he regressing to his childhood? But somebody else has got a different version, and I think there's some merit in this. We were contacted, and our viewer said, Mr. Colville's campaign to save the hedgehog may not be as aimless as you think. Don't be surprised if next there is a campaign to classify it as an endangered species. Under Agenda 21, this classification would then allow government to collect fees, regulate landowners, which makes it very difficult and even impossible for people to live on their land. If anyone thinks that this is not possible, it is happening in the US, where even pests are being placed on the endangered species list, such as the pocket gopher, a type of mole, followed by impossible regulations for landowners. UN Agenda 21 is absolutely being used for this all over the US. You will recall that the standoff at the Bundy Ranch in Nevada last year was in part precipitated by the US government declaring the desert tortoise an endangered species and thereby restricting their land use and cattle grazing. Now, this is a very, very interesting comment. Is Oliver Colville regressing to his childhood, or is this man bringing in a rather more devious agenda? We will keep digging, and we're encouraging our viewers and listeners to do the same. Well, if Oliver Colville is up to hedgehogs, our other Plymouth Tory MP says that there needs to be a change to oversee veterans' care. Apparently the government can't cope with this anymore, so we predict that Mr Mercer will be putting more power into the hands of unaccountable charities and non-government organisations. At the end of the day, the veterans will continue to suffer. Economy, Mike's. This one has popped up here, sorry.
Yeah, well, we've been warning about this, haven't we? And finally, the Daily Mail getting on to 2 million workers trapped in low-skilled jobs, highly qualified employees unable to find better roles because companies refuse to offer flexible working. And, of course, the article itself diverts itself into flexibility in working and part-time working and all this kind of stuff. The key point here is it not, the 2 million workers are, quotes, trapped in low-skilled jobs. Why do we have 2 million low-skilled jobs? Why have we abandoned any notion of producing a skilled workforce? These are all rhetorical questions, of course, but they're questions that need to be answered by David Cameron and George Osborne, I believe. And this is reflected absolutely by Paul Craig Roberts in a blog post that he made a couple of days ago, where he's analysing the most recent, what he calls wonderful US jobs report, because, of course, in December, 292,000 new jobs were created, allegedly. 161,000 were reported by the Labour Department to be taken up by Americans over 55 years old. And in many cases, these are second and third jobs. So how is this a good thing? The people are requiring second and third jobs in order to make ends meet. Younger workers, anybody from 16 to 45, according to Paul Craig Roberts, are having a worse time. Workers in their 40s and 50s suffered a large net loss of employment, and so it goes on. So really, on both sides of the Atlantic, we're seeing similar things. And as Paul Craig Roberts puts it, we're looking at non-tradable service jobs, which neither create goods or trade, nor are affected by it, and whose wages are low. Some 1.185 million fewer Americans were in the workforce in December than 1 year earlier, despite the fact that the statistics, in inverted commas, claim that there were 200 or 300,000 extra jobs. So we're seeing the same thing, both sides of the Atlantic, absolute rubbish quality jobs. We're both turning into nations of shelf stackers and coffee servers, as we keep saying.
Can we say, Mike, being turned into nations of shelf stackers and coffee servers?
Only if we sit back and accept it, of course.
Indeed. Well, after some pretty heavy news, as always, the good news is that this is being built somewhere in Scotland, I think. Dundee. We thought we'd just post this up. People are beginning to look at the SNP and the rising police state in Scotland and grasp what's really going on. So we look forward to seeing the Sturgeon memorial statue, creative artwork appearing in due course. It's pretty tall, that thing, I have to say, looking at the scale of the people in the bottom right of the picture. We should be measuring it in feet and inches, though. Well, we'll end there. Dangerous times in UK. Many people are contacting at the moment to say they can see what's happening. They can see the political picture unfolding. They say, what can we do? Our answer remains the same. Get out there talking to your friends and family. Don't try and give them all the picture at once. Give them part of the picture. Encourage people to research and start to bring our MPs and local councillors in particular to account as to what's happening. If you know any policemen and women, talk to them. Court staff, spread the truth about what is really happening, because the truth and exposure are the two edges of that sword. Can we stop it? We think so. It simply takes enough people to stand up and be counted. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.